My dad humiliated me at a party. 24 hours later I owned the room. I want to tell you about the night my father stood up in front of 40 people, held a glass of wine in his hand like it was a gavel, and told a room full of guests that I was, in his words, the disappointment he tried not to talk about. I want to tell you what happened in the 24 hours after that, because I have never in my life felt anything like the quiet that settled over me once I understood what I was actually looking at. Not anger. Not yet. Just a strange, cold clarity, the kind you get when a fog lifts and you finally see the shape of the thing that has been standing in your room the whole time. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was 34 years old, sitting at a round table near the back of my parents' anniversary party, wearing a blue dress I'd bought specifically because my mother said blue was flattering on people who carry a little extra weight, which was her way of complimenting and wounding me in the same breath, the way she always had. I want you to understand that this wasn't the first unkind thing that had ever been said in that family. It was just the first one said in public in front of witnesses with a microphone. My father, Richard, was giving a toast. He did this at every family event because he liked being listened to more than he liked actually saying anything. He talked about his 38 years of marriage to my mother, about the company he'd built from a garage into a regional logistics business with 14 trucks and 40 employees, about how proud he was of his family. And then his eyes moved across the room and landed on my older brother, Evan, and he said the word legacy, and something in his voice changed, warmed, the way it always did when he talked about Evan. Evan was 2 years older than me, ran the operations side of Dad's company, drove a truck he didn't need to drive anymore just so he could post pictures of himself in a hard hat looking like a man who worked with his hands, and had, as far as I could tell, never once in his life been asked to explain himself for anything. My father continued his toast, moving into a section about how grateful he was that Evan had stepped up when Dad needed him, how Evan understood what it meant to carry a family forward. And then because my father had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon, and because some cruelties only surface once the filter of sobriety burns off, he looked over at me. I remember exactly where I was sitting, third table from the left, next to my husband Marcus, who I felt go rigid beside me the second Dad's eyes landed on my face, and he said, "And then there's my daughter, who still hasn't figured out what she wants to do with her life. Some of us build something. Some of us just complain about it." The room laughed. Not everyone. But enough people laughed that the sound of it filled the space between us like water rushing into a cracked hull. My Aunt Carol laughed. My cousin Denise laughed, the same cousin who had asked me for a loan 2 years earlier that she never paid back. My mother didn't laugh, but she didn't stop it either. She sat there with her wine glass halfway to her mouth and her eyes fixed on the tablecloth, and that, somehow, hurt more than the laughter did, because my mother's silence had always meant agreement. I want you to know that I didn't run out crying. I didn't throw a glass or flip a table because that's not who I am, and honestly that's not what this story is about. What I did was sit very still, feel my face go hot, feel Marcus's hand find mine under the table and squeeze it once, hard like a signal, and then I smiled, a real smile or close enough to fool a room of people who weren't looking that closely, and I said loud enough for the table to hear, "Well, someone has to keep an eye on the numbers." And I laughed along with them, because 11 years of being the quiet daughter in that family had taught me that the fastest way to survive a public wound is to pretend you didn't feel the knife. But I felt it. God, I felt it. Here's the part they didn't know. Here's the part nobody at that party knew. Not my father, not my brother, not my mother sitting there in her silence. 2 years earlier I had left my job as a mid-level project manager at a shipping software company to start my own consulting business, quietly, without fanfare, working nights and weekends to build a client base while still keeping a day job for the first 8 months, because I don't take reckless risks, I take calculated ones. My business, which by that point had 6 steady clients and one very large one I'll get to in a moment, was not something I talked about at family dinners, because every single time I had ever mentioned wanting to build something of my own, my father had smiled the particular smile he used when he thought something was cute rather than serious, and said some version of "That's nice, honey," in the tone you'd use on a child who says she wants to be an astronaut. So I stopped telling them things. That's the real quiet revenge in this story, if you want to call it that, not what happened 24 hours later, but the 2 years before it, where I simply stopped handing my family the parts of my life that they had proven over and over they didn't know how to hold gently. That night, after the party, Marcus and I sat in our car in the parking lot of the country club my parents had rented for the evening, and he asked me if I was okay, And I said the thing I always said, which was, I'm fine. And he didn't push because he'd learned a long time ago that pushing only made me build the wall higher. But then, as I was staring out the windshield at the string lights someone had wound around the trees outside the clubhouse, something shifted in me. Not rage. Something quieter and more dangerous than rage. A decision. I said, I want to see the company financials. Marcus looked at me like I'd changed the radio station mid-song. What? Dad's company. I want to see the books. He asked me why, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't fully know yet, except that something had been nagging at me for months, a small itch at the back of my mind that I'd been too polite, or too tired or too conflict-averse to scratch. See, here's a detail I hadn't mentioned yet, because it didn't seem important until that moment in the car. 6 months earlier, my father's company had become one of my clients. Not directly through me, but through a subcontracting arrangement with one of the logistics software platforms I consulted for. I had access through that platform to certain anonymized operational data. I wasn't supposed to look at specific company names, that wasn't my job, and I never had, out of respect, out of some old stubborn hope that if I just stayed in my lane, my father would eventually see me as someone worth respecting. But that night, sitting in the parking lot with my father's words still ringing in my ears, some of us complain about it, I stopped caring about staying in my lane. I want to walk you through what I found because this is the part where the story stops being about a mean toast at a party and starts being about something much bigger, something that had been sitting under the surface of my family for years waiting for someone to finally look. The next morning, a Sunday, I woke up at 5:30, before Marcus, before the sun, and I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold before I took a second sip. I logged into the platform's admin dashboard, the one I use for 3 other logistics clients, and for the first time in 6 months, I typed my father's company name into the search field. My hands were shaking a little, which surprised me. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything specific. That was a lie, and some part of me already knew it. What came up first was ordinary shipment volumes, route efficiency scores, driver retention numbers, the kind of dry operational data that would put anyone else to sleep but that I actually found soothing because numbers don't lie to you the way people do. Numbers just sit there waiting to be understood. And as I scrolled, something caught my eye. A vendor line item repeated monthly for consulting services, paid to an entity called Wren Logistics Partners LLC. $4,200 a month every month for the last 4 years. That's just over $200,000. I didn't recognize the name. That alone wasn't strange. Companies pay consultants all the time. And my father's company was big enough that I wouldn't necessarily know every vendor. But something about the cadence bothered me. Real consulting engagements have texture. They spike during busy seasons, they dip during slow ones. Sometimes they stop entirely when a project wraps. This was flat. Exactly $4,200, exactly once a month for 48 months straight, like clockwork, like a subscription rather than a service. I did what I do for a living. I pulled the thread. It took me most of that Sunday cross-referencing public business filings, because Wren Logistics Partners LLC was registered in our state, which meant its formation documents were public record. I found the registration. It had been formed 4.5 years earlier. And the registered agent, the person listed as the organizer of the LLC, was my brother's wife, Priya. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a long time. Now, I want to be fair here because that's important to me in telling this story honestly. A company being owned by a family member isn't automatically fraud. Sometimes families set up legitimate vendor relationships with relatives, and if my father knew about it, if it was disclosed, if the work was real, then this was nothing, just an uncomfortable little detail of nepotism in an already nepotistic family business. But something told me to keep pulling, and so I did. I spent that Sunday afternoon going through everything I could legally access. I want to be clear that I never hacked anything, never accessed anything outside the scope of what my professional login already permitted me to see as an authorized consultant to that platform. I checked the terms of service twice before I let myself keep going, because the last thing I wanted was to build a case for myself while breaking a rule that would disqualify me from ever using it. Everything I found through legitimate means, public filings, the operational dashboard I already had contractual access to, and eventually later that day my own memory, because once you start looking for a pattern, you start remembering all the small strange moments that never quite added up before. I remembered, for instance, a conversation from about 3 years earlier, at a 4th of July barbecue, where Evan had mentioned, almost bragging, that Priya had started her own little consulting thing. And my father had laughed warmly and said something about how nice it was that she had found something to do. I remembered thinking at the time that it was odd phrasing for a business owner to use about his own daughter-in-law's company, especially since Priya, as far as any of us knew, had zero background in logistics. She'd been a dental hygienist before she married Evan. I remembered filing that detail away as one of those small oddities that families produce constantly, and that you learn not to examine too closely, because examining your family too closely is how you end up alone at Thanksgiving. But now I was examining it. And it wasn't just the $4,200 a month. Once I looked at the broader vendor list, I found 2 more entities tied to Evan and Priya's household, one called Meridian Fleet Consulting, paid roughly $6,000 a month for the past 2 years for what was listed as Fleet Optimization Advisory, and another smaller one, EJP Holdings, which had received 4 separate lump sum payments over 3 years totaling almost $90,000, categorized vaguely as special projects. I looked up EJP Holdings. The registered agent was Evan himself. I did the math, sitting there at my kitchen table with my coffee gone cold and my heart going in a way that felt less like grief and more like the click of a lock turning. Over roughly 4 years, somewhere close to $400,000 had moved out of my father's company into entities controlled by my brother and his wife, dressed up as consulting fees for services that, as far as I could find any evidence of, were never actually performed. No deliverables. No reports. No meeting notes. Nothing on the shared drives our family sometimes use for scheduling events. Just money moving quietly every month like a second invisible payroll that only 2 people in the world were on. And here's the detail that turned my stomach the most. Just 8 months before that anniversary party, my father had sat all 3 of his adult children down, myself, Evan, and my younger sister, Naomi, and told us with real sadness in his voice that the company had tightened its belt considerably over the past 2 years, that margins in logistics had gotten brutal, that he'd had to lay off 4 employees, including a man named Gus who had worked for him for 19 years, and who my father used to call part of the family. He told us this while also telling us gently that he wasn't sure the business would be able to support any kind of meaningful inheritance the way he'd always hoped, that we shouldn't count on much when he and Mom were gone, that we should all be building our own financial futures rather than waiting on his. I remembered sitting in that conversation feeling guilty for even having thought about inheritance, feeling ashamed that the topic had ever crossed my mind, telling him I understood completely, that of course we didn't expect anything, that his health and happiness mattered more than money. I remembered Naomi crying a little, not out of greed but out of worry for him, because she loved him uncomplicated, in the way I sometimes wished I still could. And the entire time he was telling us that story about scarcity, about belts tightening, about 19-year employees getting laid off, he was funneling $400,000 to my brother's household through fake consulting invoices. I called Marcus into the kitchen and I showed him everything, laid out on my laptop screen in tabs, and I watched his face go through the same journey mine had, confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of quiet, cold understanding. He asked me the obvious question, which was what I planned to do about it. And I told him I didn't know yet. I told him I needed to be sure. I told him that before I did anything, I wanted to talk to one person, someone who had known my father longer than almost anyone alive, and who had no reason to lie to protect him. That person was my father's younger brother, my Uncle Tom, who had also been the company's outside accountant for the first 12 years of its existence before my father brought bookkeeping in-house. Uncle Tom and my father hadn't spoken much in the last several years, not out of any dramatic falling out, just the slow drift that happens between brothers who grew up close and grew apart quiet. But Tom had always liked me. He used to slip me $20 bills at Christmas when I was a teenager and tell me to buy something just for you, not something practical, which was the opposite of everything else my family had ever taught me about money. I called him that Sunday evening. I told him what I'd found. I asked him if he thought it was possible my father knew about the payments to Evan and Priya, or if it was possible someone in the company was running this without my father's knowledge, maybe Evan alone, maybe someone else entirely, using Evan's and Priya's names. Tom went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then he said something that changed the entire shape of the story for me. He said, "Your father has personally approved every vendor payment over $1,000 since the day he started that company. He doesn't trust anyone else to touch that button. If those payments went out, he signed off on them himself." That was the moment the story stopped being a mystery and became something much heavier. Not a question of whether my father was complicit, but a question of why. Why would a man cry in front of his 3 children about scarcity and layoffs while simultaneously funneling nearly $500,000 to one son, and never once, not in 34 years, offer his daughter anything but a polite smile and the word cute for every ambition she'd ever confessed to him? I think some of you already know the answer because it's not really a mystery at all once you strip away the specifics. It's the oldest story there is. My father had built his entire identity around Evan being the heir, the successor, the version of himself that would carry the company and the name forward, and somewhere along the way, that identity had calcified into something my father needed to protect even at the cost of honesty, even at the cost of fairness, even at the cost of standing up in front of 40 people, and using his daughter's ambition as a punchline to make his son's inheritance feel earned by contrast. I didn't sleep much that Sunday night. I lay in bed running through my options, and I want to be honest with you about something. My first instinct wasn't confrontation. My first instinct was to let it go, the way I'd let so many things go over the years, because confrontation in my family had never once led anywhere good. It usually just led to me being labeled dramatic, sensitive, difficult, while everyone else got to remain reasonable simply by staying quiet. But then I thought about Gus, the man with 19 years at the company, laid off so my father could keep telling a story about tight margins while writing $400,000 in checks to his golden son. And something in me hardened. I decided I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to storm into my parents' house and throw papers on the table like something out of a courtroom drama. I decided I was going to do the one thing my father had never expected from me in 34 years, which was to simply calmly present the facts, in front of the people who needed to hear them, the same way he had humiliated me in front of the people who'd needed, in his mind, to hear his version of the truth. There was a family lunch already scheduled for the next day, a smaller gathering than the anniversary party, just my parents, Evan and Priya, Naomi and Marcus and me, meant to be a casual continuation of the anniversary weekend at my parents' house. 24 hours after the toast that had humiliated me in front of 40 strangers and family friends, I would be sitting at that same family's table again, except this time, I would not be smiling along. I spent Monday morning preparing, not out of vengeance but out of the same instinct that made me good at my job. You don't walk into a meeting with vague suspicions, you walk in with documentation. I printed out the vendor payment history from the platform, redacting nothing that was already legally mine to view as the assigned consultant. I printed the public LLC filings showing Priya and Evan as the registered organizers of Wren Logistics Partners and EJP Holdings. I printed a simple summary spreadsheet for columns, date, entity, amount, category that laid out in the driest possible font exactly how much money had moved and where. I put it all in a plain manila folder because I wanted no drama in the presentation, no big reveal music, just facts on paper, the same tool my father had used his entire life to run his business, now turned toward him. Marcus asked me, as we drove to my parents' house that Monday afternoon, if I was scared. I told him the truth, which was that I wasn't scared of my father anymore. Not in the way I had been for most of my life. I was scared of what it would feel like afterward, when the dust settled and I had to live in whatever new shape my family took once this was out in the open. That fear didn't stop me. It just rode along in the passenger seat with me the whole way there. Lunch started ordinarily. My mother had made her usual lemon chicken, the kind she always made for gatherings because it was easy and nobody ever complained about it. My father was in a good mood, the particular good mood he got the day after hosting a successful event, full of himself in a way that was almost boyish. Evan was talking about a new truck the company had leased. Priya was scrolling through photos from the anniversary party on her phone, showing Naomi one where my father had his arm around Evan, both of them laughing. I let the meal go on for almost 40 minutes before I said anything. I want you to understand that this wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. I wanted everyone relaxed, unguarded, present, before I said what I'd come to say. When the conversation hit a natural lull, the kind that happens right after everyone's finished eating and before dessert comes out, I set the manila folder on the table next to my plate and I said calmly, I wanted to talk about something before we have dessert. It's about the company. My father, still in his good mood, waved a hand and said, Company talk at lunch, really? In the tone of a man expecting to be humored and moved past. I said, It'll only take a few minutes. And then I opened the folder. I laid the spreadsheet in the middle of the table first, the 4 simple columns, and I said, I do consulting work for a logistics software platform. Dad's company uses that platform. Over the last 4 years, I found that the company paid out just over $400,000 to 3 entities registered to Evan and Priya for consulting services with no documented deliverables. I placed the LLC filings next to the spreadsheet, Priya's name highlighted on one, Evan's on the other. These are the public formation documents. I want to be clear, I'm not accusing anyone of anything yet. I just want to understand what these payments were for, because 8 months ago, Dad told the 3 of us that the company couldn't support any kind of inheritance because margins were too tight, right around the same time Gus got laid off after 19 years. I want you to picture that table. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, hovering there for what felt like a full 10 seconds before she finally set it down without taking the bite. Naomi's face went from confusion to something sharper as she started doing her own math out loud, quietly, almost to herself, mouthing numbers, her lips moving the way they used to when she was a kid struggling through long division at the kitchen counter. Evan's face went white, then red in about 4 seconds, the fastest emotional transition I had ever seen from him, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite assemble. And Priya didn't even try to hold a neutral expression. She looked at Evan first, not at the papers, which told me everything about how much she already knew. Her hand, I noticed, had gone still on the stem of her wine glass, fingers frozen mid-turn, like she'd been caught in the middle of a motion she now didn't dare finish. The house itself seemed to go quiet with them. I remember the specific sound of the ceiling fan ticking overhead, a small imperfection in its motor that had always been there but that none of us had ever noticed before, because there had always been noise to cover it, laughter, the clink of serving spoons against porcelain, my father's voice filling every open space in a room the way it always did. Without his voice filling it, the room felt suddenly larger, colder, like a stage after the audience has gone home. My father, to his credit or perhaps to his enormous discredit, didn't deny it right away. He didn't do the thing I'd half expected, which was to explode, to call me dramatic, to accuse me of snooping through things that weren't mine to see. He went quiet, the way he did in business meetings when a number came in worse than expected, and he reached for the spreadsheet and looked at it for a long time. "Where did you get this?" he finally said, not as an accusation, more like a man trying to locate the ground beneath him. I told him the truth plainly, the same way I told Marcus, that it came from a platform I had legitimate professional access to, that everything else was public record, that I hadn't gone looking for a fight, I had gone looking for an explanation because the numbers didn't make sense next to the story he'd told us 8 months earlier. Evan tried to jump in at that point, tried to say something about how the payments were legitimate, that Priya had done real consulting work on route optimization, that I didn't understand the business well enough to see the value in what she'd done. And I said gently, because I genuinely wasn't trying to humiliate him the way I'd been humiliated, then it should be easy to show me the deliverables, the reports, the meeting notes, anything. And he didn't have anything because there wasn't anything, and everyone at that table, including my father, could see in his face that there wasn't anything. My mother finally spoke, her voice small in a way I'd never heard it before, and she asked my father if it was true. And my father, staring at that spreadsheet, at the neat little columns I'd built specifically so there would be no ambiguity, no room for spin, said the sentence that I think will stay with me for the rest of my life. He said, "I didn't think anyone would ever look. Not, it's not what it looks like. Not, let me explain." Just an admission, quiet and almost tired, that the entire architecture of the deception had been built on the assumption that his other 2 children simply wouldn't check, wouldn't have the skills or the will to check, would keep believing whatever story he told them because that's what they'd always done. I didn't yell. I want to be honest, some small wounded part of me wanted to stand up and finally say everything I'd swallowed for 11 years about the smiles that called my ambitions cute, about the toast the night before, about the word disappointment hanging over that room of 40 people. But I didn't, because I understood, sitting there, that the facts on the table were doing something that yelling never could. They were making the room see, for the very first time, exactly who had been telling the truth in that family and who hadn't. And that clarity, quiet as it was, felt more powerful than any outburst I could have staged. Naomi was the one who eventually broke the silence in a way that surprised me. She looked at our father and asked, in a voice shaking with something between grief and fury, why he'd told us the company couldn't support us, why he'd let Gus go, Why he'd sat across from us 8 months ago and cried real tears about scarcity while quietly paying our brother's household $400,000. She wasn't asking about the money for herself. I could tell that. She was asking because the story he'd told her, the version of him she believed, had just been proven false, and Naomi has always needed the story to be true more than she needed the money to be fair. My father didn't have a good answer. He said something about wanting Evan to feel secure taking over the business, about worrying that if Evan didn't feel financially stable he might leave and go work somewhere else, about how he'd always assumed I was settled because Marcus had a stable job, which was its own quiet insult buried inside an excuse, the implication that my own ambitions, my own business, my own labor, didn't count as something that needed supporting because a man in my life already had a paycheck. I told him calmly that I hadn't come to that lunch to take anything from Evan or to destroy the business. I told him I'd come because I was tired of being lied to and then mocked for the very qualities, carefulness, discretion, the willingness to build quietly instead of loudly, that had actually allowed me to find out the truth in the first place. I told him that the version of me he'd stood up and humiliated in front of 40 people the night before, the daughter who hadn't figured out what she wanted to do with her life, ran a consulting business successful enough that she had legitimate professional access to his own company's vendor data, and that maybe, if he'd ever asked me a single real question about my work instead of smiling that particular smile, he would have known that a long time ago. I want to tell you what happened next because this is the part of the story that I think surprised even me the most. My father didn't rage. He didn't storm off. He sat there, an old man in his own dining room, looking smaller than I had ever seen him look, and he said he needed time to think about how to make this right, both with the company and with Naomi and me. He said it in a tone that, for the first time in my life, sounded less like a man managing his image and more like a man actually afraid of what he'd built. The following weeks weren't neat. I won't pretend this ended in some perfect movie scene where my father wept and apologized fully and everything healed overnight, because families don't work that way and I'd be lying to you if I told you it did. There were hard, cold conversations. My father brought in an actual accountant, not family this time, to audit the last 5 years of vendor payments properly. Evan and Priya had to pay back a portion of what had gone out under vague special projects categorization, though the two arrangements with slightly more documented, if inflated, deliverables were allowed to stand after renegotiation at fair market rates. My father restructured his will, this time with an estate attorney present who made sure every one of his 3 children understood, in writing, exactly what to expect. No more scarcity stories designed to manage our expectations while money moved quietly to a favored heir. Gus, the man laid off after 19 years, was quietly rehired into a consulting role, and I happen to know my father personally called him to apologize, though I wasn't in the room for that conversation and don't know exactly what was said. My relationship with Evan is still healing. Slower than I expected. Faster than I feared. He apologized to me about 6 weeks after that lunch, awkwardly, in the parking lot of a hardware store of all places, both of us standing between our cars with a cart of mulch bags between us, and told me he hadn't fully understood how it looked from where I was standing, that he'd let himself believe the money was simply what he deserved because he'd stayed close to Dad and I hadn't. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and I meant it, though I also told him that understanding how something looks isn't quite the same as understanding how it feels, and that we still had work to do before I trusted him the way I once had. He nodded at that, quietly, and for a moment he looked less like the golden son I'd grown up resenting and more like a tired man who had finally been asked to stand on his own, without his father's thumb on the scale, and wasn't entirely sure yet if he could. There's a smaller moment from those weeks that I still think about often, maybe more than any of the bigger ones. About a month after the lunch, Naomi called me late one night, well past 11, and asked if she could come over. She sat on my couch with a mug of tea she never drank and told me that what bothered her most wasn't the money. It was realizing how easily she believed the version of our father that made her feel safest, and how she'd let that comfort stop her from ever asking the harder questions I'd apparently been quietly asking for months. I told her I understood completely because for most of my life I had done the exact same thing, just in a different direction. I had believed the version of myself my father handed me, the unambitious one, the one who complained instead of building, right up until the numbers on a screen forced me to stop believing it. My father has never again, in any setting, public or private, made a joke at my expense about ambition or direction or what I've done with my life. Whether that's genuine change or simple fear of what I might quietly discover next, I honestly can't say. And I've stopped needing to know the answer in order to feel at peace with it. What I can tell you is this. 24 hours after my father stood up in front of 40 people and called me a disappointment, I sat at a different, smaller table and laid 4 pieces of paper next to a plate of lemon chicken. And in the quiet that followed, for the first time in 34 years, I watched my father look at me the way you look at someone you have badly, dangerously underestimated. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth, laid out plainly and without apology, was louder than any toast he had ever given. And it was the first time in my entire life that a room full of my family sat in silence, not because they were embarrassed for me, but because they were finally, quietly seeing me clearly. And that, more than any inheritance, more than any apology, more than any restructured will or reinstated employee, was the thing I had actually been waiting my whole life to receive.